famous project by Google, Project Aristotle, Project Oxygen, where they found in their multi-year quest to understand what made great teams great, the top on the list was psychological safety.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the My DevSecOps community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out mydevsecops.io to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk is a dev-first security company helping companies fix vulnerabilities in open source components and containers without slowing down development. To learn more, visit snyk.io. On today's episode, Guy Podjarny, president and co-founder of Snyk, talks to Gene Kim. Gene is a multi-award-winning CTO, researcher, and author, and has been studying high-performing technology organizations since 1999. He was the founder and CTO of Tripwire for 13 years and has written 6 books, including the Unicorn Project, the Phoenix Project, and the DevOps Handbook.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning back in to The Secure Developer. Today we have a great luminary in the world of DevOps and an early security kind of advocate and leader in Gene Kim. Gene, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Oh, great to be here, and congratulations on an exciting start to 2020, Guy.
Thank you. So, Gene, we could cover, it was really tough to sort of pick the topics to talk to you because, you have such a rich history in both sort of the security side and the DevOps side. So instead of me kind of not doing it justice, can I ask you to just, you kind of went into security and then out of security. Tell us a little bit, your journey, but not really. I guess you're sort of still there. What was your sort of path into security with Tripwire and then, past that till today?
Oh, for sure. I'll first give you my official introduction, and then I'll weave in kind of my strange journey in and out of security, as you said. So I've been studying high-performing technology organizations since 1999, and that's a journey that started back when I was a CTO and technical founder of a company called Tripwire, which is in the information security space. And so I was there for 13 years, but the journey of study of high performers continues to this day. And so this research really focused on these amazing organizations that were simultaneously the best in development. They were the best in operations and also the best in security. And so kind of not unsurprisingly, that led to stumbling into the DevOps movement, which has been one of the most exciting, rewarding journeys in my entire career. So that led to writing the Phoenix Project in 2013, the DevOps Handbook in 2016, and most recently the Unicorn Project. How does security fit in? So I got my first job as a system administrator when I was in high school. So I was writing automated QA tests for the file system for SunOS and also doing system administration. And it was during that time when the Internet Morse worm hit. And so I couldn't help but notice that there was one person at Purdue University generating all these amazing papers on what were the methods of exploit, how could you better prevent, detect, and correct for it. And so that was Dr. Gene Spafford. And so that's why I went to Purdue. That's why I wrote the original version of Tripwire, which went on to become the most widely used security tool for Unix at that time. By that time, 1997 came around, and we decided to commercialize it through a company. That's kind of the funny thing is that it was my observation that these high performers, they weren't high performers because of great security organizations. They were high performers because of great operations organizations. So I gravitated towards ops because it was my observation that that's where the saves were made. We saved the customer from terrible developers who blew everything up in production because they didn't test enough. There was ops who protected our data despite ineffective security people. And so that's kind of how I think that led to me studying security from a different angle than the most of the security profession. Indeed. And now as someone who self-identifies not as an ops person anymore, but as a developer, I have now a whole different sensibilities around security. I want someone just to do it for me.
Yeah, well, you represent every piece of the DevSecOps kind of a trio, on a kind of a personal and visceral type of way. Well, I think I love that, and I think sort of probably the ops perspective and maybe even the start of that, and you could probably even almost claim Tripwire was like an ops, I guess, the InfoSec product, but it's probably had more appeal to sort of ops people than many other security offerings out there. So I guess it's not that much of a surprise that kind of that world has led you to sort of digging into the merger of those two spaces.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, in fact, to resonate with you, right? It was our observation, and we actually validated this through benchmarking, very much like we did in the State of DevOps report, was that the organizations that had the best security outcomes were the ones that had the best change control strategies and configuration control strategies. And so it's about making sure that what was running in production matched known good build, that changes were visible and were authorized. So the thing about authorization probably is not as true now, nearly 15 years later, but it was really this kind of aha moment that security had more to do with not the vulnerability management practice or the practice of internal security. It really had to do with things outside of security, which I think was a very powerful epiphany for me.
Yeah, for sure. Let's maybe sort of dig in, into kind of that knowledge that's trapped in your mind there. Let's start that journey with the Unicorn Project. So you just wrote that book, and it touts, not to do sort of too much sort of spoilers over here, right? But it revolves around these 5 ideals. Can you give us like a quick overview of what the book is, and then we'll kind of start with DevOps and switch to security.
Unicorn Project is based on Parts Unlimited and the same timeline as the Phoenix Project. But instead of being told from the ops leadership perspective, it's really told through the eyes of a senior developer. And I think it made me gravitate towards that subject is really there's all these problems that still remain. There's the absence of awareness of all these things that are required to enable developers to be productive. And there's also this other problem of like data, just like the DevOps movement rightly pointed out how difficult it was to get code to where it needed to go, which is in production so that customers are getting value. The same thing exists with data where it's often locked in systems of records and data warehouses where it takes weeks, months, or quarters to get to where it needs to go, which is in the hands of developers to use in daily work. And I think the other thing that I wanted to really explore was this very often there's a lot of resistance to support new ways of working, right? People in functional silos who want to do things a way that they've done it for the last 20 years. And information security is certainly one of them, but it's not just information security. It's QA, it's development, project management. So all these things we need to change the way we work. And so the vehicle to tell that story was the 5 ideals. The 5 ideals are really meant to articulate kind of the things that I just have a lot of passion and I think are very important to me. So the first idea is locality and simplicity. That's really meaning to what degree can developers do what they need to do in one place versus scattered or splattered everywhere. The second is what I think the outcomes are, focus, flow, and joy. So when developers are able to do what they need to do without having dependencies on scores of other people, they can actually focus on what they need to do, and we get a state of flow, meaning that state we feel when we lose track of time or maybe even sense of self, right? Because we love the work so much. And that requires the third ideal, improvement of daily work even over daily work itself. And technical debt there's no way to eradicate technical debt without that ideal. That requires the fourth ideal of psychological safety. To what extent can we talk about problems without fear of being blamed or ridiculed or being diminished? And then the fifth ideal is customer focus. To what extent can we really focus on the needs of the customers for what customers depend on, right? The core competencies of our organization that create lasting, durable business advantage versus context, which is everything else, might be mission critical, but it's not what our customers value. So, those are meant to really embody those concepts.
Got it. Well, powerful ideals, and what might say you can write a book around those. If we dig a little bit into those, maybe like these are all told from a developer's lens, right? Yeah. Like you sort of think about those, it's organizational ideals, but they're from a developer lens, right? So maybe let's kind of dig into each one of them a little bit and talk about how can they manifest in the context of security, right? Because the book is mostly around the developer experience in the DevOps surrounding, but as we said, the whole thing is intertwined. So let's kind of go through them one by one instead of the
For
5.
Sure.
And I'll play kind of the annoying devil's advocate a little bit, just sort of as we explore.
Absolutely. So the first is locality and simplicity. I love the best metric around this, I would call the lunch factor, right? Is, if I need to get something done, how many people do I need to take out to lunch, right? And so in the ideal, right, it's like the Amazon ideal of the 2-pizza team. It means every team can independently develop, test, secure, and deploy value to our customers without having to deal with 20, 30 different teams, right? Or in a complex deployment, you probably have to take the entire building out to lunch, right? And so that means it's slower, the outcomes are worse, and so forth. And so in the ideal, right, everything's not tightly coupled together. So to deliver a feature or implement a security control, ideally we just need to make a change in one place, one file, one module, one namespace, one application, one container, whatever. Not ideal is you have to change everything. So I think in security is equally, if we sort of invert the point of view. In security, we want the same thing, right? We want a central point of control. And I think this is why things like Kubernetes sidecars or aspect-oriented programming are so important, because it means, in Kubernetes, right, if you change a sidecar, every component or every container that depends upon that sidecar can also benefits from it. You can change it in the sidecar, and then every proxy, every database connection, and so forth can benefit from that. So I think it's great for development, and it's great for security too.
And the principle, so there's security, there's development, and then there's the security that a developer might do.
Yeah.
So I like that. So there's sort of the sidecar notion, or maybe other sort of I guess framework, sort of platform. Maybe it's like React's resolution of sort of cross-site scripting, right? Or sort of
great example.
Maybe took a crack at that as well. So you have some security elements that are sort of built into the platform, where the security could inject into the platform for it.
Nice.
How would you say, when you talk about locality though, and you talk about something that applies only to this application, does that imply that, like, would you say developers should basically think about each one of these systems as local to the other systems as well? That other 2-pizza team that sits off to the side, would the principle here be to also kind of disregard them, or sort of think of them as just like the adversary, and kind of protect your perimeter of the not actually like go throw stuff at them, but just in terms of like your own inputs and perimeters, treat them as untrusted?
I think that might be a part of it. I think maybe in the extreme example is what happened when in Amazon in their Abidos system in 2005, where basically everything over the years, everything became complected together, where in order to make any change in display logic or business logic or anything, you had to touch that one system, right? That, all the database stored procedures. And so, I think that you could call that, yeah, exactly, right? And so that happens to all of us. And so the countermeasure for them was that famous Jeff Bezos memo that said the only way that teams should interact is through hard APIs. Right. And so that forced the rigid separation, right? Not so that they're untrusted. It meant that it re-enabled teams to be able to work independently of each other. And so I think a side effect is when you have that kind of bounded context or domain-driven design is suddenly teams that were once intertwined and complected together are liberated from each other. And so they can actually work independent. And the result at Amazon is amazing, right? They went from no one being able to make changes to doing the numbers, I think it was 11,000 deployments per day in 2011, 136,000 deployments per day by 2017.
Yeah,
right. That is
numbers,
it's a great proxy to what extent are developers able to do what they need to get done.
But is it fair to say that from a security perspective, for you to be able to provide or sort of allow that autonomy, then to an extent, each of these teams also needs those APIs to be security boundaries. Like they also need those APIs to say, well, I won't trust that that other team has validated inputs and things like that before they got into my backend microservice, because, well, I guess you're also doing end-to-end teams, but still you have to think about those APIs as a secure
for
interface.
Sure. And I think there's something even more profound that happens, which is that all of these teams are working independently. In the ideal, right, they're using common platforms as the security teams build for things like authentication, rate limiting, and so forth, because ideally, we don't want each team to create themselves. I think one of the best examples was Microsoft. They did an internal benchmark many years ago, counting how many XML parsing libraries they have. And the answer was like 300. Because everyone had to build their own because the cost of taking a dependency was so high. Their formulation was, we should have one. And we should use whatever Bing uses because that is likely the most correct, the most performant. And so, that is indeed the case with their one engineering system, which is they have one XML library that is used across every Microsoft product. And so I think we can have those security concerns or expertise, whether security, performance, QA, embedded in platforms that can be universally used, then everyone benefits from that expertise.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess that's kind of where simplicity kicks in. So like locality, we could kind of come out of this and say locality is locality from the other teams. And you need to, just as you're sort of driving API interfaces, those APIs should be trusted. And then simplicity is really where you need, whether be it sidecar or a input sanitization library or whatever it is, you need your security team and your platform to kind of help build components in. And you're not local from the platform, but that's okay. You're building on the platform. And the platform should make it simple.
Another marvelous side effect, right, is that if you find an issue in the input sanitization library, right, you can fix it in one place. And then ideally, very quickly, right, that can then be inherited by every other organization every other team within the organization. So that has definitely satisfied that principle of locality.
Yeah, no, excellent. Yeah, and especially it'll get there very, very fast if you do 136,000 deploys a day. That's an especially sort of fast. Okay, cool. So we solved 20% of the world's problems over here. Let's go to the next 20%. So the second ideal, focus, flow, and joy. How would that manifest for security?
Here's kind of the funny security journey for me. It's my belief that for developers, right, we want their best energy spent on solving the business problem. And what that means is that we don't want them having to worry about things outside the application, right? In terms of having to worry about input sanitization or authentication, authorization, secrets management. In fact, what I found now self-identifying as a developer is that there are all these things I used to love doing, especially as an ops person, right? That I just despise doing now. I hate anything dealing with YAML configuration files. I hate connecting anything to anything else because it always takes me a week. Secrets management, I always get wrong. I'm the jackass who always puts secrets accidentally into the repo, right? And I don't know how to take them out. I'm the person who you don't want doing anything involving Kubernetes. I loathe. So these are all important things. Oh, dependency management, right? It's like updating dependencies, very, very important. So all of these things are important. It's just things that I don't want to do anymore. And so I don't say to diminish these things. I think it just shows what the economic cost is to take a developer out of that state of flow, where they're doing their best work and then having them deal with something outside the application. So it really, in my mind, it just shows how important platforms are, where you can take the expertise of, people in infrastructure, operations, QA, and security, and use that to support developers that don't need to worry about it. And by the way, when I use the word flow, I'm really citing the work of Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He gave the best TED talk ever about flow, the state of optimal experience. And he describes flow, as I mentioned, that sense when you're working on something, you lose track of time, even sense of self, that transcendental experience we have, when we just are doing the work we love and we don't have to worry about Googling Java time formats, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you find yourself kind of coding at 3 a.m. because you just didn't notice that it's 3 a.m.
Exactly.
You're just in that sense of creation. I think that's an excellent place, and absolutely a place where sort of security sometimes kind of interrupts and you feel like, you're being poked incorrectly. So, okay, so I love that. And I think that principle works, I guess, for any aspect of work. Maybe I have an example. Tell me if it sort of, works well, of like a mistake I often see, which is in the context of dependencies, oftentimes people would break the build whenever a vulnerability is discovered. And then one, I guess, breaking of the flow is, you run a build, and since the last time you ran the build, the new vulnerability has been disclosed and it affects one of those libraries. And so you're in the flow and you're running this build. You haven't touched this dependencies. You don't even know what that is. And you break the build. And so that might be like one small example of it, but it's about like consider the sort of the developer flow and what they're doing, and when should you interrupt them? Like, this is a critical, pull the cord, stop everything. I don't care that I'm interrupting your flow. You have to fix this right now. Or is this something you can report in a more elegant way, less interruptive way, async way?
That was such a great question, and I almost want to answer in two ways. One of them is through the third ideal of improvement of daily work. Here's the basis. I have a couple experiences that might resonate with people. I mean, I do all my programming in Clojure, which is a functional programming language that runs on the JVM. And even there, there's a lot of updates and components, but that's nothing compared to the NPM ecosystem, where it's just orders of magnitude worse. And I have personally had this experience where you don't build your stack, in this case it's like React Native, you don't build it for 60 days and 60 days later it won't even compile anymore, right? Because of God knows what. And so that is a level of how dynamic the supply chain is, just breathtaking. And so I got a chance to work on the software supply chain, state of the software supply chain with the folks at Sonatype, where we looked at the Maven Central ecosystem. And one of the most astounding findings was around the psychographics of developers. And we asked one question, like, to what degree do you consider updating dependencies and patching vulnerable components painful? And kind of three clusters emerged: high pain, low pain, and medium pain, right? And if you look at the low pain people, one of the most startling differences was they are 10 times more likely to update dependencies as a part of daily work. It meant that if you were, whether it was daily or weekly or some definition of regularly, it meant that when very important vulnerabilities were disclosed and you had to change them right away, the ones that experienced the least amount of pain were the ones that had some practice at doing it. And more importantly, they had some rigor and discipline about doing that, not just when emergencies happened. And it does suggest that it was Jeremy Long, he is the author of the OWASP Dependency Check Project. It really validates something that he's talked about, which is really the best way to stay current on patching is just to update dependencies all the time, right? And that was certainly validated in this research.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think, first of all, very elegant kind of segue into that third ideal, but also like, I think absolutely, like basically you want to invest in being ready to fix. And in the context of dependencies, a lot of that is to just sort of be on top of things. And I like saying that if updating is a risk and not updating is a risk,
right.
You just need to sort of pick which one is, and the vulnerability that gets disclosed just changes the risk equation, just sort of basically says, what is it that balance sways, because not updating is now a bigger risk than it was moments ago.
It's nuts. In fact, like another kind of stark difference between the high performance and low performance, where the ones with the lowest amount of pain were 11 times more likely to have some strategy at either being at most current or current -1, right? And just it says, they have some sort of strategy that says, here is where we're going to be at. We're not going to be at bleeding edge. We're going to be at bleeding edge -1 or bleeding edge plus 2 weeks or something that gets us out of this horrible problem where we're so far behind, we don't even know how to get to the latest version.
yeah. That journey is like full of peril on its own right.
By the way, this is a great presentation that the GitHub folks made about like their journey from updating from Rails 3 to Rails 4. And, it took them, I think, years, right? Just in time for Rails 5 to come out. And it just makes you wonder, like, there's something really, really wrong when just staying current is this much work. And yet that is a reality.
Yeah, it is. Well, and maybe back to your roots a little bit, in the server world, we've actually kind of built a little bit of a norm that you just constantly update. You constantly take this feed of updates, oftentimes without even knowing what you've just updated.
Yeah.
And you sort of take the next thing. And not doing that is the anomaly, are the ones that aren't typical. Well, in the application dependency world, it's the opposite. You have to opt in. So.
Yeah. In fact, maybe over drinks sometime, it is. And I think it's based on this very crazy fact of life that, despite semantic versioning, it's acceptable that you have breaking changes in your API, right? Which, in a more just world, right? Wouldn't life be simpler if we could actually trust that our components won't break us when we update them?
Yeah, sort of make those, interesting kind of equation there as well around sort of pace of innovation. So I think we've covered 3. I guess we'll kind of throw in that sort of improvement of daily work in this last one. The next one is really interesting, psychological safety. That one's finicky for security. How would you apply psychological safety to security?
Oh, that's such an interesting observation. Yeah, so psychological safety was also covered in the State of DevOps report and in the Accelerate book that I co-authored with Dr. Nicole Forsgren and Jez Humble. And the way we talked about it was through the Westrom organizational topology model. So the low bad culture is, information is hidden, messengers of bad news are shot, we discourage novelty. Whereas good culture was measured by what they call generative. We seek information. We train messengers to tell bad news. We encourage bridging between teams. Novelty is encouraged. And the Unicorn Project did force me to go back in the literature and look at the famous project by Google, Project Aristotle, Project Oxygen, where they found in their multi-year quest to understand what made great teams great, the top on the list was psychological safety. To what extent do people on the team feel safe to say what they really think without fear of ridicule, castigation, blame, and so forth? And year over year, that was the most decisive factor in terms of correlating with great teams. It wasn't the manager, it wasn't the roles and responsibilities. It was really neat to sort of look through the literature through that lens. And one of my friends, John Smart, he was formerly the head of Better Ways of Working at Barclays, that eventually spanned across all of the major divisions of operations there. And he's now a partner at Deloitte. He gave a talk at DevOps Enterprise just a couple of months ago about the need for psychological safety and security too, just really painting how treacherously dangerous it is to report bad news when you are in a regulated industry and when you can actually disrupt business operations by raising an issue. That is, he spoke very bluntly about it, is that is not a psychologically safe environment, right? You are discouraged to tell bad news. So I think there's this incredible symmetry about how important it is for development, as well as, oddly enough, I think one of the most psychologically unsafe places to be is in security, where I think many, many high-profile security breaches where there was the largest loss of PII on the planet were, I think, pretty obvious that someone was sitting on some bad news and they were just not capable of communicating that to the right person with adequate fidelity for the right things to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazingly both one of the areas that is hardest to maintain psychological safety and yet the most important, because it's precisely the place in which you want you want people who see something to say something, right? Like, you want them to be informed. You want to be informed, but it's quite tough.
Oh, by the way, a friend of mine, John Willis, he told me about this amazing story at Fannie Mae where they found an Apache Struts vulnerability, and they actually took one of the most major business applications offline over the weekend because it was the opposite. They actually said, our mission is to protect the American mortgage holders, so it is better to take the application down than to potentially jeopardize them by leaving the application up. And I think that kind of paints a shining opposite example of what could be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great example. Like, clearly, it's not awesome to sort of take a system down, but it's very kind of consumer and sort of customer-minded course of action for it. Do you think, when it comes to security mistakes, right? When you think about security incidents that happen due to, inevitably there's almost always someone made a mistake, which, we're all human. Are there any specific best practices you've seen around trying to assess, security incidents or even proper size breaches? Are there organizations or examples that do this well for DevSecOps, for application security and the people involved?
For me, I think that I wouldn't say this is practical yet, but I think this is the true north that we should be aspiring to. So in the Fannie Mae example, right, they said we must take this application down because the harm to consumers and how it jeopardizes the real mission of the organization is so jeopardized by this that it's better to take the application down than leave it up running in an insecure state. And then really the question then becomes, how do we engineer the environment, the systems, so that next time around we can actually have more assurance that we can more quickly, seamlessly, and painlessly upgrade and patch, just like we should be able to do an OS hotfix, as you said, silently, invisibly, painlessly, constantly.
Just do it. Yeah.
Right. And so that's a heavy lift. And I think kind of ultimately that is where we need to go. And so that's more on kind of the engineering side. But I think that is really that's the problem that really attracts me. By the way, the other thing just kind of came to mind as we talk about psychological safety is there's so many examples of where information was hidden in an organization that turned out to have horrific outcomes, whether it was Boeing 737 MAX or the diesel engine emissions fraud at Volkswagen, right? I mean, those are also kind of similar examples where, despite all the norms being set by leadership, or maybe because of the engineering norms, the norms set by leadership, information was hidden that did a grave disservice to the organization, consumers, society, et cetera. So, I think in the next decade or two, it will be more obvious on how do we sort of encourage the right things to happen all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with both the importance and the complexity or sort of the difficulty of doing it. So, which kind of gets us to the fifth ideal, which I think we actually started sort of touching on, the customer focus. So how do you see customer focus coming into play in security? And maybe even specifically for DevSec, if you will, for security of the digital world inside the business.
Yeah, and this one I have the least number of answers on, but I know it's important. So for me, just to kind of paint why this was such an aha moment, I got to spend a day with the CEO of CompuWare, kind of the famous mainframe vendor, with my friend Dr. McKirsten, CEO of TaskTop. We went there because we learned so much from him over the previous 2 years. So we're walking to their campus. I'm looking at the agenda, and the first thing on the agenda is a data center tour. And I turned to Mick and I actually apologized to him. I'm like, I don't know why we're getting a data center tour. I'm not sure what we're going to learn by looking at their halon extinguishers. And yet it was such an aha moment because you walk into the data center and it was essentially empty, right? Because, there were 2 Z mainframes that were running. And then, the rest, it was empty data center space. You look on the floor and there's all these green outlines like in a murder scene where the racks used to be with these tombstones that said what business process used to run there and how much money did they save by getting rid of it. And so there were things like, it was the ERP systems, it was the email systems, it was the treasury functions, desktop backup. And so essentially the formulation was cores are core competencies that customers pay us for, and everything else is context. So things like their payroll systems, their customers don't care. And so they essentially were able to reallocate $8 million of costs from back office to R&D, which customers do care about. And so for me, that was just this incredible aha moment of how context can starve core. And so to be able to reallocate $8 million from context to core was an aha moment. And so I think it just shows one of the aha moments that came after that was, how important the systems that support dev productivity are, because the more we can make our developers productive so that they can focus on what they need to do without having to worry about these non-functional requirements like security, right, the better. And so it means that a lot of systems might go away, but it does elevate the importance of the systems that developers use in their daily work.
Yeah, I like that. I guess if I kind of rephrase a little bit, you might say that the security teams themselves need to remember that the goal of the organization is not to be secure. The goal of the organization is to provide value to customers. And being secure is one of those means of doing so, right? Because you're not successfully providing value to customers if you're putting their data at risk. But fundamentally, just being there, stifling innovation and saying no to everything, not allowing anything through, kind of helps you be secure all the way to bankruptcy, right? Like, sort of helps you fail, like
that. And Alex Stamos, who was the CTO at Facebook and before that Yahoo, right? I mean, he had this kind of marvelous post about kind of what the modern security organization looked like. And a lot of it was around these kind of principles, like, best way to eliminate PII risk is to get rid of it, right? Move it to another vendor, right? Where it's their core competency. And he kind of paints this vision of just reducing the vulnerability footprint and surface area by 2 orders of magnitude. So I think that's very much in line with customer focus. Exactly,
yeah. And I guess the one other observation I'll sort of make is that some previous kind of guests that were here, I guess kind of most notable was Jeff at Slack, talked about, for those components that you keep, trying to kind of highlight or describe them in terms of customer success. And Slack did some great campaigns about it. Actually, like Andy Ellis said at Akamai, being secure is kind of almost one of the key selling points. And so in those cases, if you're going to do it, flaunt it a little bit, right? Sort of, just sort of point out and describe it as a customer value and being able to kind of represent that to the world.
And what a great place to be, because that's now funded out of the R&D efforts, right? It's being funded by the same place that generate features, which is the ideal place to be. And, if you have to secure these kind of back-end systems that no one cares about, that's part of the cost center. I mean, it's difficult, maybe impossible to get funding for that.
Jude, we've got like a whole world of other things I want to talk about. We're going to squeeze 2 more in, maybe, because I think we're already going a little bit longer than intended. So one is, you mentioned it in passing, the sort of this state of software supply chain report that you've done. I know you've dug into 4 sort of hypotheses there. Can you give us like the lightning summaries? People can go off and kind of read the report, but kind of the lightning summary of what were sort of the 4, what was this report? What was sort of the 4 key hypotheses, and what happened?
Perfect. Yeah. So there are 4 hypotheses we set out to confirm or disprove. Finding number 1 was that project release frequency would have better outcomes. And that turned out to be absolutely true. They were, I think, 4 times as likely to be among the most popular projects. They had more developers assigned to them, right? So that turned out to be true. Second hypothesis were projects and components that update dependencies most frequently also have the best patching behavior. And so that also turned out to be true. The third hypothesis was we thought that the components with the least number of dependencies would be the most secure. And that kind of makes sense, right? It's because if you have fewer dependencies, it's easier to update, et cetera. Not true. We found that it was actually the opposite. The projects with the most number of dependencies had the best patching behavior. They had more developers. They were more popular. Very interesting. They update dependencies 50% faster. The last finding was actually the most troubling. So we thought that the popularity of the project, as measured by GitHub stars or forks or Maven Central downloads, would be the most secure. And that turned out to have no correlation on anything, right? The time to update, time to patch, release frequency, et cetera, which is, I say, troubling because often I am adding dependencies to my project, and the only thing I look at is the number of stars and forks, and which turns out to have no predictive, no correlation with anything you care about. So it says that this industry definitely does need better ways to discern, which components should you take or not.
Yeah, absolutely. This is fascinating, and I think the more light we shine, on the complexity here, the better informed we are. I guess that's a DevOps principle as well, right? Which is, you can't optimize what you can't measure, right? Yeah. And you have to really kind of dig into those to sort of understand, the problems that plague us, right? And how is it that we can improve, to sort of get better as an industry and as a community.
Absolutely.
One last bit, I ask every guest this, so you're not going to get away without it as well, which is, you have a lot of insights, and you're talking to ops teams, to security teams. Pick kind of your audience, if you will. But if you had one bit of advice, or maybe it's a pet peeve that you want to make sure people stop doing, or a bit of advice to for a team looking to level up their sort of security foo, what would that bit of advice be?
Yeah, I'll give one high level one that's almost applied to you, but then one very concrete one. And I think the whole notion of shifting left, baking security into every stage of daily work, I mean, that's one of the most decisive findings in the State of DevOps report. But then to do something very tactical is something that I'm actually not very good at, and I'm always looking for better ways, is that advice from Jerry and Long, is that the best way to stay secure in terms of updating is just to update dependencies all the time. And it's not something that I'm terribly good at, but I know it's important. And it's certainly borne out by the research. The notion that we have to make updating dependencies something that we do in general, and that will pay off in spades when there is a vulnerability. My favorite example that Jeremy Long told me about was the prime faces vulnerability, where the fix actually was shipped years ago. But when the vulnerability was discovered, that's when it started getting exploited. So the people who stayed up to date never had the vulnerability, right? It was actually the publishing of the CVE that led to the mass exploitation of it. It was so wonderful to validate that wonderful intuition in the research. So it's something that we need automation to do. And I think it's something that if developers aren't doing it, in the better universe, security teams would be helping create better tools to make that possible so that developers don't need to worry about it.
Perfect. Very concrete, and I couldn't agree more. So, Jin, thanks a lot for having you on this, for kind of coming here to join us on this show.
So great to be here.
A pleasure as expected.
Wonderful. I'm very much looking forward to our next hangout.
Indeed. And thanks everybody for tuning in, and I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. For additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit mydevsecops.io. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved with the community, you can also find us on Twitter at @mydevsecops. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.